Tonight we drift back into a world where candles glowed like tiny suns, and the stone walls of ancient castles held whispers older than memory. A world of quiet corridors, cool winter air, and the soft rustle of woolen gowns passing through the shadows. A world where Princess Elizabeth, a young daughter of England's royal house, lived her days not in grandeur alone, but in moments of gentle stillness, listening, learning, and quietly observing the life unfolding around her. In this slow journey, we won't rush through battles or chase the loud echoes of history. Instead, we linger in the small things, the hush of dawn on a castle courtyard, the warmth of a hearth on a cold morning, the distant voices of villagers carried on a winter breeze. Here, you are invited to breathe a little deeper, to let your mind soften, and to walk alongside Elizabeth at a pace unhurried by the world outside. Let the sounds fade. Let the shadows lengthen. Tonight, we return to the medieval world not as spectators of great events, but as quiet companions sharing the simple rhythm of a princess's everyday life. Settle in and allow the stillness of the past to guide you gently toward rest.
Somewhere in the earliest hours before dawn, when the corridors of the stone keep still held the deep, unmoving cold of the night, a single candle flickered along a narrow passageway. Its light trembled over uneven walls, catching in small pockets of moisture where the stones had gathered the chill. This faint glow, no wider than a cupped hand, was the first sign of morning inside the royal keep of Winchester, a lonely spark that traveled ahead of the quiet footsteps of a servant girl whose duty it was to wake the youngest princess of England. The castle was not silent, not truly. Medieval silence was a living thing, full of tiny movements, the shifting groan of wooden beams swollen with damp, the drip of cooled rainwater slipping from the roof into stone drains, the scratching of mice behind grain chests, the soft, distant whicker of a horse stirring in the stables far below. But to a child who had known little else, this muted language of stone and timber was the comforting heartbeat of home. For Princess Elizabeth, barely 10 years old, the keep echoed with a familiar quiet that felt as natural to her as breath. Long before she opened her eyes, the world around her carried on its slow, ancient rhythm. The hearth in her chamber had burned low during the night, leaving a bed of orange embers beneath the weight of half-collapsed logs. The tapestry on the far wall, worked in soft woolen threads, depicting the figures of St. Catherine and St. Margaret, billowed slightly when a draft brushed past its lower edge. Outside her shuttered window, the wind shifted gently across the courtyard, carrying with it the faint, earthy scent of damp straw and early morning frost. Elizabeth lay curled beneath heavy woolen blankets, their coarse fibers warmed by her breath and body heat. Children of nobility slept in softer conditions than most, but compared to later centuries, even a princess's bed was spare. The mattress was a thick sack filled with feathers and dried moss. The blankets were woven from the same wool that clothed shepherds and monks. Only the small embroidered pillow beneath her cheek, worked by her own mother's household years ago, hinted at royal gentleness. The door eased open. A small figure slipped through. Eleanor, one of Elizabeth's young attendants, carrying the candle in a polished iron holder. The flame trembled each time she breathed. She reached the center of the chamber, set the candle on a small oak stool near the bed, and knelt silently to stir the embers back to life. A few sparks leapt upward, scattering reddish light across the princess's sleeping face. The servant girl paused, watching the tiny curls of warmth rise from the hearth. There was something peaceful about these moments, before the world remembered its duties and expectations, before the keep grew loud with clattering boots, barking orders, and the iron rhythm of daytime routines. Elizabeth stirred. A slow inhale, a shifting of blankets, the faintest brush of her hair against the linen. She did not open her eyes yet. Children in the medieval court learned early to wake in stillness. Noise was considered undisciplined, even ungentle. Her first thoughts of the morning were quiet, drifting things, whether it would be cold outside her bed, whether she would hear birds when the shutters were opened, whether her older sister would be in a kind mood today. Everything came softly. When she finally blinked into the dim light, the world around her looked as if it were painted in shades of amber and muted gray. The candle's glow softened every shape, the carved wooden chest at the foot of her bed, the simple crucifix above the door, the small stool with its worn cushion, the neatly folded pile of linen for the day ahead. All of it existed gently, without urgency. "Good morning, my lady," Eleanor whispered, inclining her head. So the young princess simply sat upright, allowing her blanket to fall into her lap. The cold of the room touched her skin in a way that felt almost ceremonial. A small reminder that comfort was not her right, but a privilege granted by God and birth. For a few moments, she looked around the room as though rediscovering something familiar, yet newly precious. Her chamber was not large by noble standards, but it was hers. A private corner of the vast stone keep where she could retreat from the constant formality of court life. A narrow window slit occupied one wall, covered by wooden shutters reinforced with iron bands. The morning light had not yet reached the horizon, leaving the room washed entirely in candle and ember glow. Shadows pooled in the corners like sleeping animals. Her first act each morning was prayer. Eleanor helped her to kneel beside the small wooden prie-dieu in the corner, a cushion folded beneath her knees. Elizabeth folded her hands, fingers small and chilled. The Latin words she recited were still tricky on her tongue, but she murmured them faithfully, envisioning her words rising like fragile offerings into the cold air above her. She prayed for her father, King Henry, absent more often than present, always riding the long roads of his realm. She prayed for her mother, who had died years ago, leaving a soft ache that the princess could not yet name. She prayed for her brothers and sisters scattered across courts and castles, each learning the burdens of noble life. And she prayed for whatever gentle joys the day might bring. When she rose, the candlelight caught the small golden threads woven into the edges of her night smock. The garment was simple but finely made, the kind of quiet luxury only nobles enjoyed, quality without extravagance. Elizabeth brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her hair was light brown, catching warm tones in the firelight, and it softened her features in a way that made her look perpetually thoughtful. The rest of the castle began to stir. A guard outside shifted his weight, the faint clink of chainmail echoing down the corridor. Somewhere below, a door creaked open, followed by the muffled thump of a servant carrying firewood. From the courtyard, a rooster cried out, insistent, rough, impatient for the world to fully wake. Elizabeth listened with a quiet attentiveness. She had always been a child drawn to small details, the way sound traveled through stone, the scent of wet earth after rain, the feeling of worn wood beneath her fingertips. Her world was shaped not by grand politics or royal declarations, but by these soft, intimate experiences. The life of a medieval princess was one of constant observation. Once the hearth had been revived into a steady flame, her attendants brought a basin of chilled water. Elizabeth dipped her hands into it, wincing slightly at the cold. Bathing in warm water was a rare privilege reserved for certain days. Morning washing was quick, brisk, and humbling. She splashed her face gently, then dried it with a strip of soft linen. The freshness of the water cleared her mind, sharpening the shapes of the world around her. As her attendants helped her dress, an activity that would become its own long chapter later, Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the window. Eleanor moved to open the shutters, and with a creaking sound, the first pale hint of morning slipped into the room. It was not yet daylight. Instead, the sky offered a soft, misty blue edging the horizon. Clouds hung low, heavy with the dampness of the English winter, and the air that seeped into the chamber carried the faint, metallic smell of cold stone. When Elizabeth stepped toward the window, she had to stand on her toes to see over the ledge. The courtyard below stretched wide and hushed. A few figures moved slowly across its surface, stable boys wiping sleep from their eyes, kitchen servants carrying baskets, a stray dog padding near the well in search of scraps. Torches still burned near the gatehouse, their smoke rising in thin gray columns. The world felt suspended between night and morning, caught in a delicate stillness that lasted only for a few breaths each day. Elizabeth loved this moment. She always had. It felt like the castle belonged entirely to her. Not the bustling stronghold it became by midday, not the echoing fortress filled with courtiers and visiting knights, but a quiet world made of stone and frost and possibility. She pressed her small palm to the cold windowsill, feeling its roughness. She imagined, as she often did, the many lives that had passed through this place. Warriors, servants, queens, children like herself. The keep held their stories in its walls. She liked to think that at night, when no one was watching, the stones whispered to one another about things long forgotten. Her governess entered with soft footsteps, bowing her head. "My lady, it is time." The day would begin soon. Lessons, prayers, small rituals, and the endless expectations of royal childhood. But before she turned away from the window, Elizabeth allowed herself one last moment of stillness. The sky brightened by a fraction, just enough to soften the edges of the distant tree line. A raven lifted from the battlements, its wings beating slowly against the morning air. She whispered a small thought, barely more than breath. "God keep us all today." No one heard it, but the sentiment hung gently in the cold room, mingling with the candle's glow, lingering in the quiet corners where childhood hopes often tucked themselves away. Elizabeth stepped back toward her attendants. Her small boots, lined with fur, touched the floor with a muted thud. She did not yet know how much this world would shape her. The damp stone walls, the flickering torches, the solemn daily rituals, the weight of lineage resting on her narrow shoulders. She only knew that the day ahead would be like so many others, slow, disciplined, filled with careful tasks. Yet within these routines, she found a kind of peace that only a child of her temperament could possess. As she left the chamber, the candle on the stool flickered one last time, casting long shadows across the room. Eleanor pinched the flame out gently, leaving only the glow from the hearth and the slowly brightening sky. The corridor outside was dim, lit by torches spaced widely apart. The scent of smoke mingled with the dampness that always clung to castle stone in winter. Elizabeth walked between her attendants, her steps light and measured. She had learned to move as quietly as her mother's memory, softly, gracefully, like someone aware that the world around her was fragile. And so the princess entered the day, guided by duty, sheltered by stone, wrapped in the quiet dignity of a medieval morning. Outside, the world whispered awake. The castle always woke in slow layers, as though each stone needed time to remember its purpose after a long night of winter silence. Even after Elizabeth left her chamber, the keep lingered in a soft half-sleep, holding on to the last threads of darkness before surrendering to the day. The air in the corridors was cold enough to nip at her cheeks, carrying with it the scent of burnt wood, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of stone chilled by hours of frost. Elizabeth walked quietly, her small boots echoing gently against the flagstones. Her attendants followed at a respectful distance, hands folded, voices withheld. In noble households, mornings belonged first to God, then to duty. No one wished to disturb the fragile peace of the hour. The princess kept her gaze lowered as she moved, watching how her breath fogged faintly before her and drifted away. That tiny wisp of warmth in an otherwise cold hallway felt like a secret, a reminder that even inside these vast, ancient walls, her own body carried the heat of life. They passed a narrow staircase leading down to the kitchens. From below drifted the soft clatter of pots, the murmur of voices, and the sharp scent of kindling being split for the morning fires. Farther on, a doorway stood slightly ajar, releasing a brief wave of warm air from one of the servant quarters. A woman inside hummed under her breath as she braided her daughter's hair, unaware that the princess was passing so near. Elizabeth paused, listening to the gentle melody, too faint to name, but soothing in its simplicity. The intimacy of the moment, a mother's care, a child's trust, stirred something quiet in her chest. It was not loneliness exactly, but a recognition of something she missed without fully understanding it. Her governess cleared her throat softly, and Elizabeth resumed walking. At the end of the corridor, a narrow slit window allowed the first true hint of morning light to slip into the hallway. It cast a pale bluish strip across the stones, stretching almost to the princess's feet. Elizabeth slowed her steps and touched the light with the tips of her fingers. It felt no different from the air around it, cold, almost damp. Yet the simple act of reaching toward it felt special. Morning light was a blessing, no matter how faint or colorless it appeared in English winter. The group turned a corner, and the great chapel corridor opened before them. Here the atmosphere changed entirely. The ceiling rose higher, supported by massive wooden beams blackened by years of smoke from countless torches. The echoes deepened, and the air felt older, fuller. A pair of guards stood at the far end, spears crossed in front of the heavy doorway. When they saw the princess, they straightened, lifting their weapons in silent acknowledgement. Their armor made only the faintest sound, a soft shift of mail against cloth, but in the quiet corridor, it seemed loud enough to disturb the morning. Elizabeth stepped past them and entered the small royal chapel. The room was dim, lit by 2 candles on the altar and another near the doorway. The scent of beeswax drifted through the air, mingling with traces of incense from the night before. A simple wooden cross stood behind the altar, its surface worn smooth where many hands had touched it during prayer. A tapestry depicting the Annunciation hung behind it, the colors muted with age. Elizabeth crossed herself and knelt on the small cushion prepared for her. Her knees sank gently into the worn fabric. She closed her eyes and let the silence settle around her. The chapel was one of the few places in the castle where she felt truly unobserved. Even though servants and attendants waited nearby, the space itself seemed to shield her thoughts, absorbing them into its ancient wood and stone. The priest arrived a few moments later, his robes rustling softly. He offered a low bow and lit 2 additional candles, their flames dancing gently in the faint draught that slipped beneath the chapel door. Morning prayers were not long, but they required deep concentration. Elizabeth whispered the responses, her voice mingling with the priest's in a rhythm older than the castle itself. The Latin words rolled softly from her tongue. Prayer, she often thought, was like walking through a quiet forest, each phrase a step forward, each breath a reminder of God's presence in the stillness. When the prayers ended, the priest gave a blessing, and Elizabeth rose slowly. Her legs tingled slightly from kneeling, and she steadied herself with a hand on the edge of the pew. Her attendants moved forward, but she lifted one hand in a small gesture. She wished for a moment more. The governess allowed it, a silent concession that childhood, even noble childhood, deserved small spaces of freedom. Elizabeth walked toward the tapestry behind the altar. She traced a finger lightly along the embroidered border, feeling the uneven texture of the old yarn. Some of the threads were frayed, others retained a faint warmth from the candles. She imagined the woman who had woven it, perhaps long dead now, sitting near a hearth, carefully pulling each thread through the fabric, crafting something beautiful for God. The thought filled the princess with a soft melancholy, a feeling like distant music drifting through memory. Outside the chapel, the keep continued its slow awakening. The first real light of dawn seeped through the arrow slits and narrow windows, shifting the interior from deep shadow to a misty gray. Elizabeth rejoined her attendants and stepped back into the corridor. The warmth of the chapel faded quickly, replaced by the cool breath of winter stone. The governess guided her toward the upper great hall, where breakfast awaited. The staircase was wide but steep, its edges smoothed by generations of footsteps. Elizabeth moved carefully, lifting the hem of her woolen gown just enough to avoid tripping. The sound of her boots on the steps created a quiet, rhythmic pattern, a steady counterpoint to the faint bustle rising through the keep. She could hear it now, a growing hum of life far below, fires being stoked, horses snorting in the stable yard, someone calling for a bucket of water, the clank of a bucket handle, the scrape of a barrel. All of it blended into a gentle chorus of daily labor, the castle stretching out its limbs after the long night. When they reached the upper hall, the servants had already begun preparing the morning meal. The hall was large and long, with high ceilings and thick wooden rafters. A tapestry depicting a hunting scene hung near the head of the central table. The colors were dim in the early light, making the figures appear more like shadows than hunters. The great hearth at the far end had been rekindled, sending flickers of orange dancing across the rushes scattered on the floor. Elizabeth approached the table quietly. She was not old enough to sit at the high table during formal meals, but morning meals were simpler and more intimate. A few nobles gathered here before the duties of the day pulled them elsewhere. A visiting knight, a steward, a distant cousin of the king. For now, however, the hall was nearly empty. Only her older sister Matilda sat at the table, her posture perfect, her expression serene. Matilda looked up when Elizabeth approached. Her face was still, dignified in a way that seemed beyond her years. At 16, she already carried herself like a young queen. Elizabeth admired her deeply, though she did not always understand her quiet composure. "You rise early," Matilda said in a soft voice. Elizabeth dipped her head. "Yes, sister." Matilda's eyes softened. She gestured for her to sit beside her. As Elizabeth took her seat, a servant placed a small wooden trencher before her, along with a cup of watered ale. The ale was cool and faintly sweet. Elizabeth lifted the cup with both hands, warming them slightly against the wood. She took a small sip. At this hour, everything tasted gentle. The ale, the bread, the soft cheese. Morning dulled the sharpness of flavors, as though the world itself was waking slowly, granting the tongue time to adjust. The hall remained quiet as more servants entered, laying out baskets of bread, small bowls of berries preserved in honey, and a plate of boiled eggs. The scents mingled softly: warm yeast, sweet fruit, the faint saltiness of cheese. Elizabeth watched it all with a quiet delight. The act of preparing food, though she did not partake in the labor, fascinated her. She admired the precision, the care, the way each movement seemed part of a well-practiced dance.
After a few minutes, her governess reminded her gently, "Eat a little more, my lady. There is instruction afterward." Elizabeth obeyed. Her fingers broke apart the bread, steam curling upward as the crust gave way. She took slow bites, letting the warmth settle in her stomach. Matilda ate with the elegance expected of a princess, her movements fluid, almost ceremonial. When breakfast ended, Elizabeth remained seated for a moment, absorbing the warmth of the hall. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending tiny sparks upward. A servant swept the rushes near the entrance, pushing aside bits of stray straw and husks left from the night before. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and wool, grounding her in a way she could not yet articulate. Matilda excused herself first, gliding down the hall with measured grace. Elizabeth watched her go, feeling a mixture of admiration and longing. Her sister seemed built from a different substance, something stronger, more certain.
Elizabeth, still young, often felt like she was made of softer things: wind, wool, candlelight. But she followed, her steps quiet but steady. Their paths diverged where the hall split into two corridors. Matilda continued toward the solar, where lessons in diplomacy and courtly behavior awaited her. Elizabeth turned toward the smaller study chamber near the chapel, where she would meet her tutor for reading and scripture. Her governess walked beside her, offering occasional reminders about posture and speech. The study chamber was small and warm, a pleasant contrast to the cold hallways. Its single window caught the morning light beautifully, creating a soft pool of illumination on the wooden table. Along the far wall, shelves held a handful of prized manuscripts, their vellum pages bound in leather, their edges decorated with careful strokes of ink. Elizabeth's heart always lifted at the sight of them. Books were incredibly rare, precious things, and she loved their quiet presence. Her tutor, Master Hugh, bowed as she entered. He was a patient man with gentle eyes, his hair touched by early gray. Elizabeth respected him deeply. He taught not with sternness, but with calm encouragement, guiding her through lessons with the same care he gave to the fragile manuscripts. "Good morning, my lady," he said. "I thought we might continue with the Psalms today." Elizabeth settled onto her stool, smoothing her gown beneath her. Master Hugh opened a small manuscript and placed it carefully before her. The inked letters, dark and slightly raised, seemed to breathe on the page. She traced a line of text lightly with her finger, feeling the slight texture of the vellum. Reading was difficult, but she cherished it. Each word felt like a doorway into a quiet world, one where she could wander without supervision. They worked slowly. Master Hugh read first, his voice low and soothing. Elizabeth repeated the phrases, stumbling occasionally on the Latin, but correcting herself with determination. The hour passed in peaceful concentration. Outside, the sounds of the keep grew fuller Footsteps, distant voices, the clang of metal in the courtyard. But inside the study chamber, time stretched gently, as if unwilling to disturb the calm. When the lesson ended, Elizabeth closed the manuscript with both hands, careful not to crease the delicate pages. She thanked Master Hugh in the polite, measured tone she had been taught, though her gratitude was genuine. She enjoyed these mornings. They offered a rare sense of purpose, a quiet mastery that was hers alone. As she left the chamber, she felt the transition, the way the calm interior gave way to the living heartbeat of the castle. The corridors were brighter now, lit by the full morning sun filtering through high windows. Servants passed more frequently, carrying baskets, linens, wooden buckets. Elizabeth stepped aside when they approached, acknowledging them with small nods. Though nobility rarely mingled with servants, Elizabeth found herself quietly observing them. The ways they moved, the tiredness in their eyes, the subtle pride in their work. The morning continued in its slow rhythm. The castle walls, once dark and still, now held the warmth of sunlight. The lingering cold of dawn softened, replaced by the faint hum of daily activity. Elizabeth breathed in, letting the air settle in her chest. The day had begun. Night still clung to the castle like a heavy cloak when Elizabeth awoke, long before the bells marked the first hour. The air held its familiar chill, that thin sharpness of early morning in a stone keep where warmth never truly settled. The fire in her chamber had dimmed to faint embers, red as the heart of a sleeping creature. Everything around her felt suspended in a kind of tender stillness, as though the world itself was waiting to be stirred gently awake. These first breaths of the day were always her own, a small, quiet pocket of time before duty, before lessons, before the pulse of court life seeped back through the hallways. Elizabeth pushed back the woolen covers, their weight both comforting and heavy, and let her feet touch the reed-covered floor. The cold rose through her skin like a whispered reminder of the life she inhabited. A princess in name, but in truth, a quiet observer of the rhythms of the keep. She dressed slowly, as she always did. None of her garments were flashy. Such flourishes were reserved for ceremony and feast days, not the steady shaping of a royal child's education. Today she wore a simple gown of dark blue wool, laced tightly along the sleeves, and a soft linen shift beneath it. Over her shoulders she wrapped a mantle lined with rabbit fur. The castle's stones had kept the nights cold, and even the torches lining the passageways would not fully warm them until noon. By the time she stepped out into the corridor, a few torches were burning low, dripping resin in steady droplets. Her footsteps, light and careful, made a soft rhythm on the worn flagstones. From far below in the kitchens, faint sounds drifted upward, clattering pots, low voices, the beginnings of the day's labors. Somewhere in the outer yard, a stable boy led a horse across the frost, the muffled hooves tapping against frozen earth. Elizabeth inhaled slowly. Mornings like this, suspended between darkness and day, made her feel as though she were walking through a space not entirely anchored in time. As though the past and future were temporarily held at bay, and she existed only in the thin sliver of the present. Her lessons would begin soon. Royal children were shaped by education as much as expectation, though not always in the way modern imaginations believed. For medieval princesses, schooling was not one long pattern of refinement and chivalric grace. It was a patchwork of practical learning, devotional training, and subtle political grooming woven together over years. much of it unfolded within the shelter of the household women, not grand masters or robed scholars. There were books, yes, but few. Precious, heavy things copied by monks whose patience seemed carved from stone itself.
There was reading, and there was writing, but neither as constant companions nor as easy as opening a bound page and letting one's eyes travel freely along lines of ink. Elizabeth understood this. Her education was not a single trail she walked, but a tapestry being stitched around her, thread by slow thread. As she moved toward the small chamber where her morning lessons took place, she passed a narrow lancet window. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale, just a faint whisper of light stretching along the horizon. Mist drifted over the fields beyond the walls, softening the edges of the world. The castle roofs, layered with wooden shingles, held a shimmer of frost that sparkled faintly in the growing dawn. She paused there a moment, resting her fingers lightly on the window's cold stone frame. She did not linger long. Time was not entirely her own. But even these brief pauses allowed her to gather herself before stepping into the shape expected of a royal daughter. Her first instructor was waiting when she reached the little room set aside for her lessons. Lady Marian, a woman of gentle temperament but steel-straight posture, had served her mother before serving her. She was not young, but not yet old, with a face both kind and subtly watchful, as though always assessing the quiet movements of the child before her. On the table between them rested a single candle, its flame a warm point in the gray morning, illuminating the parchment laid neatly beside it. "Good morning, my lady," Marian said with her usual steady softness. Elizabeth curtsied, her motions smooth, born of practice rather than natural elegance. "Good morning, Lady Marian." They began with reading, as they almost always did. Reading was a prized skill among noblewomen, not universal, but greatly valued where it existed. Elizabeth traced the letters with her eyes, sounding each word carefully under her breath. The manuscript was a devotional text written in Latin, a language that still felt foreign on her tongue despite months of repetition. Yet there was a comfort in its patterns. She knew the prayers, even if she could not recite them perfectly. Their cadence was familiar, like footsteps echoing softly through the stone chapel near her chamber. Outside the door, servants passed, carrying rushes for the hallways, buckets of water, baskets of bread for the morning table. Their movements created a distant hum, the quiet heartbeat of the keep. Lady Marian corrected her gently when she stumbled, but never with impatience. Elizabeth felt her chest loosen as the lessons continued. She wanted, quietly, deeply, to be good at this. Not because it was expected of her, but because the act of learning itself made her feel as though her inner world were widening, stretching beyond the castle walls. When the reading was finished, Marian introduced a small wooden writing desk. Writing was harder, ink thick, quills sharp, parchment unforgiving of mistakes. A blot of ink could ruin a page and weeks of labor. Today, Elizabeth practiced simple phrases, copying lines slowly, her hand steady despite the cold. Each stroke of the quill felt like drawing breath. Each letter, carefully formed, made a quiet claim upon the parchment. The candle flickered. "Very good," Marian murmured, noticing the improvements in Elizabeth's strokes. Approval was not frequent in this world. Praise in a royal household was measured like spices in the kitchen, used sparingly, lest too much spoil the discipline expected of a noble child. But when it came, it warmed her more deeply than any fire. When writing was finished, Elizabeth was permitted a short break. She stepped through the corridor again and found herself drifting toward the chapel. Its doors were open. The faint scent of incense lingered from the dawn service she had been too young to attend. Inside, the air was still and cool. Candles burned along the altar, their flames steady. Shafts of pale light entered through small glass windows set in lead. She walked quietly to the first row, her hands folded loosely before her. The castle chapel was not grand. It was simple, modestly adorned, a place for monks and household servants as much as for the royal family. But in its stillness, it felt vast. Sound softened there. Even the faint scrape of her shoes against the stone seemed swallowed by some gentle presence. Elizabeth knelt, not out of obligation, though that was expected, but out of a quiet pull within her. Prayer, to her, did not always mean words. Sometimes it meant simply being still enough to hear her own thoughts. Sometimes it meant sitting in a silence that held the weight of centuries. She prayed as she prayed most mornings, gently, without urgency, asking for nothing but clarity for the day. The rituals of devotion taught to noble girls were not merely religious. They were soothing frameworks for a life otherwise shaped by others' ambitions. They gave shape to the inner world. When she returned to the schoolroom, her next lessons had begun to unfold. Mathematics, though not by that name. Arithmetic in the medieval sense, enough numbers to manage estates, to understand household accounts, to track the yields of land that might one day be hers in dowry. A princess was not raised to be idle. Her future lands, her household, her marriage, all required a certain fluency, not the softness imagined in stories of courtly ladies. Marian guided her through tallies and simple sums, using smooth stones placed carefully in rows. It was not easy, but Elizabeth found a calm rhythm in it, the way one found rhythm in sorting grain or threading a needle. Patterns revealed themselves slowly, quietly, like seeds taking root. Later they studied etiquette, the delicate choreography of noble life. This was not the dramatic elegance painted by later romantic imaginations, but a subtler, firmer discipline. How to sit without seeming rigid, how to speak without inviting offense, how to observe silence in a way that suggested wisdom, not fear, how to lower her gaze when necessary, and how to raise it when strength was required. In those lessons, Marian's voice softened even more, as though speaking of things that could not be learned through instruction alone. Elizabeth listened, absorbing not only the rules, but the undercurrent beneath them, the understanding that power and vulnerability were interwoven through every gesture. When the sun finally reached the high points of the sky, a warm breeze entering through the narrow window cracks, Elizabeth was led to yet another part of her education, the women's solar. The solar was one of her favorite places in the castle. Situated on the upper floor, it received the best light of the day, especially in the late morning. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting saints and beasts, their colors faded by decades of sun. A hearth burned in the far corner, attended by servants who occasionally added logs to keep the chill away. Here, noblewomen gathered to sew, embroider, spin, and discuss the quiet workings of the household. It was here that Elizabeth learned the domestic arts that would define her role as a lady of estates one day: weaving, mending, ordering fabric, recognizing good wool from poor. These skills were not mere hobbies. They were essential tools of governance in a world where estates ran on the labor of dozens, sometimes hundreds, yet always required a steady,
competent mind at their center.
Lady Marian and two other gentlewomen showed her how to thread the needle through wool, how to make the stitches even, how to keep the fabric taut on its frame. Elizabeth's small fingers fumbled sometimes, but not from lack of care. The wool was coarse, rough against her skin. Every now and then she pricked her finger, drawing a tiny bead of blood that she wiped quickly on her sleeve. Despite the small pains, she found tranquility in the act. Sewing had a rhythm, a soft repetition that soothed the mind. While the women spoke quietly around her, she let the rise and fall of their voices become part of the stillness, like wind passing through leaves. They discussed modest things, the new litter of puppies in the hall, the quality of the flour ground that week, the subtle tension between two kitchen servants. Never gossip in its harshest form, but gentle news, softened by the familiarity of daily life. Elizabeth listened quietly. She learned as much from the women's voices as from the lessons themselves. She learned what it meant to manage a household not merely through command, but through presence, a gentle stewardship shaped over years. By the time midday arrived, trays of simple food were brought to the solar: pottage, a bit of bread, a sliver of cheese. Princess or not, meals during lessons were modest. Feasts were reserved for holidays, celebrations, or visiting dignitaries. Ordinary days called for ordinary food, eaten in quiet companionship. After the meal, her final lessons of the day began in the outer courtyard, where a small patch of grass softened the hardness of the keep. Here she practiced basic riding skills on a gentle mare named Rowan, her coat the color of spring mud. Elizabeth was not yet permitted to ride beyond the inner grounds. Such freedom was reserved for older children, but even riding in circles brought its own quiet joy. Rowan's slow, steady pace felt like drifting on a calm river. A stable hand guided her, walking beside the horse, offering soft corrections. The air was fragrant with hay and earth. The castle walls rose high around her, enclosing her world, but also protecting it. Through the gate she could see a glimpse of the forest beyond, its trees swaying slightly in the cool wind. When the riding lesson ended, Elizabeth was guided indoors once more. The afternoon light lengthened, slanting golden across the corridors. Her body felt tired in a gentle, satisfying way. The tiredness that comes from learning, from moving, from being fully present in the world. Yet her day was not quite over. Before the evening meal, she was brought to the private chamber of her mother, Queen Matilda, whose presence carried a quiet gravity Elizabeth had always revered. The Queen was seated near a window, a scroll of parchment resting on the table beside her. Her dark hair was partially covered by a linen veil, and her expression, as always, was composed, though touched with a softness reserved only for her children. Elizabeth curtsied deeply. "Come, my child," the Queen said, her voice gentle but layered with the firmness of one who bore the weight of a kingdom. She beckoned her closer, and Elizabeth obeyed. These moments were not formal lessons, but they were lessons nonetheless, the most important ones of all. The Queen taught through conversation, through presence, through quiet example. Today she asked her about her studies, her prayers, her reading. Elizabeth answered honestly. The Queen listened with a steady gaze, nodding occasionally, offering a few guidance-filled words in return. They sat together in the late afternoon light, the silence between their words warm and calm. Elizabeth felt small, but not insignificant. She felt anchored, a young girl rooted in a lineage centuries old, yet still free to observe the world with wonder. When evening settled, the castle lamps were lit one by one, their light soft and flickering. Servants moved through the halls preparing for supper.
Elizabeth walked slowly toward the great hall, her steps echoing gently, her mind drifting over the tapestry of her day. She had read, written, counted, prayed, sown, ridden, listened, and learned. Not all at once, not hurriedly, but as part of a quiet rhythm that shaped her life, day after day, like water softening stone. Education for a medieval princess was not a path of brilliance or performance. It was a steady shaping of character, a cultivation of patience, piety, competence, and quiet strength. It was, like the castle itself, built stone by stone, each small action reinforcing the foundations beneath her. As she stepped into the hall, lit by torches reflecting off wooden beams overhead, she felt the familiar weight of her place in the world. Not heavy, simply present.
Another day had passed in the schooling of a quiet princess, and another would follow. But for now, she allowed herself this moment. The gentle hum of the hall, the warmth of the fire, the soft clatter of bowls, the distant murmur of winter wind against the walls. She breathed in slowly, letting the peace of the hour settle over her like a warm cloak. And in that breath, she understood something she could not yet name, that learning was not merely lessons. It was the slow awakening of a life. The castle was not merely a place where Princess Elizabeth lived. It was the shape of her days, the boundary of her childhood, the silent companion that watched her grow from the moment she first opened her eyes. To understand her world was to understand the stone that held her, the walls that echoed her footsteps, the narrow windows that framed every season of her life. Few in later centuries would imagine how a royal child truly lived. The tales of silk-draped chambers and carefree play were inventions of a world that wished to soften the past. The truth was quieter, steadier, shaped as much by stone and silence as by courtly grace. The 12th century keep that guarded Elizabeth's days was a gray, towering presence, built for safety rather than comfort. Its walls were thick enough to resist fire and siege engines, its stairways narrow and curved to slow approaching enemies, its floors cold and uneven after decades of wear. For Elizabeth, these details were not frightening, they were familiar. The castle had cradled her since infancy, and she had grown used to its moods, its creaks, its faint drafts whispering through arrow slits. She never thought of it as imposing. To her, it was simply the world. Each morning, before lessons and duties began, she often walked along the outer passage of the keep. The stones were cold beneath her slippers, even in the height of summer. Her hand brushed along the wall as she walked, the surface rough and ancient, dotted with marks made long before her birth. Torches burned in their brackets, filling the corridor with the faint scent of pitch. Sometimes the guards nodded to her as she passed, though they rarely spoke. Royal children were greeted with a respectful silence, not out of coldness, but because the separation between roles was understood by all who lived within these walls. Beyond the corridor lay the heart of the keep, the great hall. It was not yet bustling at this hour. The long tables were empty, the cressets unlit. A few servants moved quietly across the floor, sweeping rushes into baskets to replace them with fresh ones. The hall felt cavernous, its high wooden beams lost in shadow. When it was filled with people, its walls absorbed the warmth of laughter, voices, and fire. But in the early morning it felt almost monastic. Elizabeth sometimes paused at its threshold, caught by the gentle hush that hovered there, as though the castle itself were taking a final breath of stillness before the day began. She continued past the hall, following the spiral staircase that wound upward like a shell.
Every morning she counted the steps, though she already knew their number by heart. Each stone had a slightly different feel beneath her foot. Some were smoother, worn down by years of passage. Others held sharper edges. She walked slowly, touching the wall for balance. The air grew cooler as she climbed. The climb itself felt peaceful, a small, quiet journey before the heaviness of lessons drew her day into shape.
At the top of the stairs was the upper walkway that circled part of the keep. A narrow parapet lined the edge, open to the sky. Here, the wind often swept through with unexpected force, carrying the scent of earth, grass, or distant smoke, depending on the season. Elizabeth loved this place. From there, she could see the lands surrounding the castle, the river curling like a silver thread through the fields, the patchwork of farmland stretching toward the horizon, the small forest to the west where winter frost clung heavily to the branches. Farther still, faint trails marked where distant villages lay beyond the hills. Standing there, she felt the strange mixture of nearness and distance that defined her life. These lands were part of her inheritance, woven into the legacy she would carry and name. Yet she knew them only from afar. She had not stepped beyond the castle grounds in years. Her world unfolded from a vantage point high above, not from the paths themselves. The people who worked the fields were familiar figures in the landscape, plowing, gathering, carrying. But she did not know their voices, nor they hers. Still, she felt connected to them in a quiet way, as though the castle's height allowed her to share a silent companionship with every soul living under its protection. The wind brushed her face. The sky was a pale wash of morning light. She lingered, breathing in the world beyond the stone. Eventually, she turned and walked back inside, where warmth awaited. After her morning observations, she sometimes wandered into the lesser-known corners of the keep. A medieval castle was not one grand space, but a collection of layered rooms, hidden passages, and small chambers that had been altered and repurposed across generations. Elizabeth knew some of these places well, perhaps better than the adults suspected. There was the narrow passage behind the chapel, where drafts always found their way through the east-facing stones. She liked the way the light filtered through the tiny window there, scattering soft patterns on the floor. There was the little alcove near the armory, where she could hear the distant clanging of metal as the smith sharpened blades. The rhythmic ringing echoed through the stone like a heartbeat. There was the small storage room, where dried herbs hung from wooden beams, their scent lingering in the air. Rosemary, sage, mint, lavender. The servants used these for medicines and cooking, but Elizabeth often visited the room simply to inhale its calming fragrance. One of her favorite places was the old tower room near the northern wall. It was no longer used for anything practical, too drafty in winter, too isolated for regular use, but it held a single, narrow window with a view of the forest. A wooden bench sat beneath that window, smoothed by time. Elizabeth often sat there when she needed a moment to gather her thoughts. The wind whistled faintly through the cracks. Birds perched occasionally on the stone ledge outside. The room felt untouched, a private chamber carved out of the centuries, as though it existed solely for quiet moments. Here, she imagined stories, not in the way children invent wild fantasies, but in the way a thoughtful mind wanders through possibilities. She wondered who had once sat in that same spot. A guard? A long-ago princess? A monk copying manuscripts before the room was abandoned? She felt the presence of those who had lived before her, their lives leaving faint traces in the stone.
The castle was layered with memories she could sense, but not name. As midday approached, the castle shifted into its daily rhythm. The clang of pots from the kitchen grew louder. The courtyard filled with movement, servants carrying firewood, stable hands brushing horses, guards changing shifts.
The blacksmith's hammer struck metal with slow, measured blows. From the outer walls, the sound of boots on stone mingled with the cooing of doves nesting in the parapets. Elizabeth moved among these sounds like a quiet thread woven through a larger tapestry. She did not run or skip. Noble children were taught early to move with intention, with a certain awareness of the dignity expected of their station. But she found a gentle comfort in observing, watching the life around her unfold in steady patterns. Sometimes she stood near the great hearth in the hall, where the fire was always kept burning. The hall was busier near midday. Servants prepared for the coming meal, laying out cups and wooden trenchers. The scent of roasting meat drifted from the kitchen, carried by the draft that came through the open doorway. The fire's warmth seeped through her clothing, easing the stiffness in her fingers brought on by the cold corridors. Though much activity surrounded her, Elizabeth rarely spoke unless spoken to. Not out of fear, but out of temperament. The castle encouraged quietude. Voices carried easily through stone. Noise disrupted work. Every person who lived there understood the value of stillness. Still, the castle was not silent. It pulsed with life. But that life moved at a slow, deliberate pace, shaped by routine rather than spontaneity. Occasionally, when her schedule allowed, Elizabeth visited the inner yard where the castle well stood. Water was drawn there all day, and she liked to watch the buckets being lowered and raised, the ropes creaking lightly under tension. A wooden roof sheltered the well, and beneath it moss grew along the stones. Sometimes children from the servant families played nearby, tossing pebbles or chasing each other around the well's perimeter. They quieted when Elizabeth approached, bowing their heads respectfully, but she could still see the flicker of curiosity in their eyes. She wished sometimes that she could sit beside them, ask their names, hear their stories. But it was not permitted. Lines between ranks were not meant to be crossed. She accepted this. She did not resent it. It was simply part of the world she inhabited, a world defined not only by boundaries, but by their quiet acceptance. One of the most striking parts of the castle was the kitchen. Unlike the stone-walled rooms elsewhere, it was filled with warmth, life, and earthy scents. Elizabeth entered only occasionally. Noble children did not often step into the heart of labor, but whenever she was permitted, she found it strangely comforting. Smoke curled upward from the great hearth. Pots simmered over open flames. A dozen hands worked in steady unison, chopping herbs, kneading dough, turning spits. The room hummed with focus, but not chaos. Everything had its rhythm. She would stand near the doorway, watching as flour dusted the air like soft snow. The cooks smiled when they saw her, though they did not speak unless addressed. Her presence did not disrupt them. They simply worked around her, their movements as practiced as the churning of a mill wheel. Sometimes the head cook, a stout man with a beard touched by gray, would offer her a small taste of something, broth from a spoon, a piece of bread still warm from the oven. She accepted quietly, offering a soft thank you. These were small kindnesses that carried far more warmth than their size suggested. After midday meal, the castle often quieted for a brief time. Servants returned to their duties, children to their lessons, guards to their posts. Elizabeth sometimes walked through the lower hall where the tapestries hung. Their scenes, saints, kings, battles, were woven in fading threads,
their edges frayed from age. She traced the outlines with her eyes, imagining the hands that had crafted them, stitch by stitch, long before her time. The castle's chapel was another place she visited often. Its tall candles flickered against painted wooden panels. The stone floor was cool beneath her feet. The air carried a faint scent of incense, residual from morning prayers. She sat quietly in one of the benches, not always praying, simply being. In the stillness, she felt the castle breathe with her. Its stones settled around her like a protective embrace. Sometimes she watched the monks move softly through the chapel, their robes whispering against the floor. They rarely acknowledged her directly. Their world revolved around prayer and duty, not courtly expectation. Yet their presence felt like a steady undercurrent, grounding the spiritual life of the castle. Elizabeth found comfort in their routine, the chanting at dawn, the quiet reading of scripture, the careful tending of sacred objects.
As the afternoon deepened, Elizabeth's own duties returned, small household tasks appropriate for a noble child. She helped sort cloth scraps in the solar, fetched thread for the sewing women, carried messages from her tutors to the Queen's chamber. These small tasks helped form discipline, but they also made her feel woven into the life of the keep. By late afternoon, the world outside shifted again. The light slanted low, casting long shadows through arrow slits and across the courtyard. The air grew cooler. Smoke from the kitchen hearths rose in pale wisps above the roofline. Birds settled along the battlements, their calls echoing faintly through the stone corridors. Elizabeth often returned to the upper walkway this hour. It looked different now, the world bathed in golden haze, the fields darkening at their edges, the river catching the last fragments of light. From here, she watched the castle's people finishing their tasks. Farmers leading oxen back toward the stables, shepherds guiding their flocks into pens, servants hurrying to prepare for the evening meal. She observed everything quietly, as though gathering the pieces of the day and placing them gently within her memory. Evening in the castle brought a calm that differed from morning's stillness. It was deeper, softened by the promise of rest. Torches were lit along the walls. Their flames fluttered in the cool wind, casting wavering patterns across the stone. Inside, the great hall filled with warm firelight, reflecting off polished cups and the simple wooden trestle tables. The scent of cooked meat drifted through the air. Elizabeth sat near the high table with her family, eating modestly and listening more than she spoke. Conversations in the hall were low, steady, punctuated by the crackling of firewood. Servants moved quietly among the tables. The hearth's glow felt like a gentle blanket around her shoulders. After supper, she sometimes accompanied her mother on a slow walk through the hall or up the stairs toward their private chambers. These moments were not filled with conversation. They did not need to be. The soft beat of footsteps on stone, the gentle hum of the castle settling for the night, the steady presence of the Queen beside her, all of it wrapped her in a quiet warmth. When she returned to her chamber, the fire was lit once more. A single candle flickered beside her bed. The room felt small compared to the vastness of the keep, but it was hers, familiar and safe. She undressed slowly, folded her mantle carefully, and slipped beneath the heavy covers. Outside, the wind whispered through the narrow window, carrying the faint sounds of the castle drifting into sleep. In the darkness, Elizabeth felt the weight of another day lived within the quiet stone world that held her. The castle was not grand or lavish, not warm in the way later tales imagined royal childhoods to be. It was rough, cold, and shaped by duty. But it was also her sanctuary, her home, the place where she was learning,
slowly, gently, to grow into the life that awaited her. She closed her eyes, listening to the distant hum of life moving beyond her chamber walls. Stone, fire, wind, silence. This was her world, and in its quiet embrace, she drifted softly into sleep. There were days, in the middle stretch of Elizabeth's childhood, when time seemed to gather itself into a thick, northern stillness, something like the fog that clung to the castle stones at dawn, quiet and unmoving, as though the entire world were holding its breath. It was in these lingering hours, fixed between morning duties and the distant clatter of courtly affairs, that the young princess first began to notice the shape of her own mind. Not through lessons of parchment and ink, not through the stern instruction of tutors, but through the slow and silent act of observing all that moved around her. The servants, the guards, the ladies, the tapestries, the pale slice of winter sun across a corridor wall. Her world had always seemed so large when she was small. Echoing chambers, cold passages, archways tall enough to frame the heavens themselves. But now, as she entered her 9th year, something shifted. The space did not shrink, but her understanding of it deepened.
Every sound found its place. Every movement carried meaning. Every expression, even the faint tightening at the corner of a maid's mouth, or the briefest hesitation in a knight's bow, quietly revealed its own story. It happened so gradually that neither she nor the adults around her recognized the change. And yet it was already shaping her a new form of learning, gentler and far older than the structured lessons of the royal household. Observation became her true tutor, patient, wordless, and tireless. That winter had been long. Snow clung to the hills and castle roofs in a carpet of pale silence, muffling the normal rhythms of life. Fires burned low and slow in hall after hall. Every voice felt softer, as if wrapped in wool. Elizabeth spent those weeks moving quietly from room to room, her hands folded, her expression mild, her presence so unobtrusive that the adults often forgot she was there. She preferred it that way. The world revealed itself more clearly when no one noticed her watching. Elizabeth had always felt drawn to the edges of things, the corners of rooms, the alcove beside the chapel door, the narrow window embrasures where she could slip into a pocket of solitude and simply listen. Though her tutors tried to teach her Latin declensions and the genealogies of noble houses, it was the unspoken language of human nature that she absorbed most readily. She noticed how the steward's pacing quickened on days when supplies ran thin. She saw how the laundress, though weary from the biting cold, always handled the royal linens with reverence, smoothing the fabric with slow, practiced care. She watched as 2 visiting knights exchanged a glance heavy with unmentioned grievances, the kind that flickered only for a heartbeat before propriety reclaimed their features. No one taught her how to read such things, and yet by watching she learned. Her governess, Lady Rowan, believed she was merely quiet. A contemplative child, she would say with a soft smile when others questioned the princess's silent attentiveness. She listens with her eyes. But the truth was simpler. Elizabeth learned because the world around her had long existed in a state of soft tension. Even as a child, she could sense it, a subtle weight that lived beneath the formalities of royal life. Every servant knew their position intimately. Every guard understood their role as precisely as the stones beneath their boots. Every lady of the court performed her duties with a careful blend of grace and restraint. And beneath it all, the unspoken truth of the times lingered like the cold. England,
even in peace, remained a land shaped by expectations and unyielding hierarchies. Elizabeth absorbed all of this without being told, and in doing so, she discovered that observation was a kind of quiet power. It allowed her to understand a world she could not yet influence. One afternoon, when the sky hung low and heavy with approaching snow, Elizabeth wandered into the great hall just as the servants were arranging it for a small gathering of the local lords. She paused in the doorway, unnoticed, the scent of burning oak drifting around her like a veil. The servants moved in quiet lines, setting out trenchers and arranging benches for the evening meal. She watched them carefully. There was a rhythm to their movements, a pattern she had learned to see. How the youngest servants hurried with nervous energy, fearful of a misstep. How the older ones moved with slower certainty. How the steward directed them with tiny gestures rather than words. The hall felt alive with unspoken coordination, every person responding to cues that did not need voice. Then she noticed something else. One servant, a boy not much older than she, was limping. The limp was small, subtle, the kind that might go unnoticed by anyone not trained in stillness. But Elizabeth saw it immediately. The boy carried a stack of pewter cups, his face set with determination, though each step sent a faint tremor of discomfort through his body. No one else seemed aware. The steward barked orders. The other servants moved quickly around him, and yet the boy attempted to match their pace, weaving through the hall with quiet strain. Elizabeth felt a tug of recognition in herself, a soft ache, not for the injury itself, but for the way it went unseen. She lingered a moment longer before stepping back into the corridor, knowing there would be no place for her interference. But she carried the image with her, holding it like a small stone in her palm. This too was a form of knowledge, not grand, not political, just deeply human. And somehow she sensed it mattered. Over time, these quiet observations shaped the way Elizabeth moved through her world. She became gentle not because she was shielded from hardship, but because she recognized its traces in others. Every person carried their own burden, even those who served her without question. And though she understood she occupied the highest rung of the social order, she did not view these hierarchies with the detachment expected of royalty. Instead, she felt a quiet closeness to the people around her, a kind of shared humanity that transcended her status. Her father, the king, rarely saw this part of her. His gaze, when it fell upon her, was filled with the distant pride of a ruler assessing his lineage. Elizabeth did not resent him for this. She understood, even at her age, that monarchs saw the world differently. Duty had shaped him as observation shaped her. But she sometimes wondered if he remembered what it felt like simply to watch the world without bearing its weight. One evening, Elizabeth found herself standing alone in the chapel. The candles flickered low, their flames casting long shadows across the stone floor. She often slipped into the chapel at dusk, not to pray, though she did that too, but to sit in stillness and listen to the quiet crackle of wax dripping, the soft settling of wooden pews. On this night, she thought again of the servant boy with the limp. The memory had stayed with her for days. She had since learned, through the soft murmurs of the kitchen staff, that the boy had injured himself while hauling water from the well, a daily task made treacherous by ice. The injury was small but painful, and in the hustle of winter duties, no one had given him time to rest. The thought pressed gently on her heart. She closed her eyes. A princess had little power, yet even little might matter. She knew that kindness was not an official duty, It was seldom recorded in ledgers or praised in the halls of kings, yet she sensed, perhaps instinctively, that the smallest flicker of compassion could illuminate the heavy corners of a life. Elizabeth began to notice other small truths that adults overlooked. How the armorer hummed to himself whenever the weather turned warmer, a habit probably older than he realized. How the castle hounds slept closer to the hearth when storms approached. How Lady Rowan's voice softened slightly whenever she read scripture aloud, as though the ancient words smoothed themselves into her breath. To Elizabeth, these details formed a gentle tapestry. They made the world feel alive. She came to understand that people revealed themselves more in silence than in speech. Words could be rehearsed, roles performed, but silence, true, resting silence, held the shape of a soul. The more she watched, the more she learned, not through ambition or pride, but through tenderness. And so, without consciously trying, Elizabeth grew into a child who listened before speaking, who noticed before asking, who saw before judging. It gave her an air of maturity that others sometimes mistook for solemnity. But she was not solemn. She was simply attentive. The world whispered, and she wished to hear it. One afternoon, during a rare patch of weak winter sun, Elizabeth sat in the courtyard watching the laundresses hang freshly washed linens. The air was crisp. The sheets fluttered like pale banners as the women pinned them carefully to the line. Their hands were red from the cold. Their movements were methodical, shaped by years of repetition. Elizabeth watched them with quiet fascination. The laundresses talked among themselves in low voices, sharing stories and small complaints, but they never paused in their work. Their lives were steady, predictable, strenuous. Yet in their shared rhythm, Elizabeth sensed a kind of strength, a form of endurance she would never need to cultivate, though she respected it deeply. A gust of wind caught one of the sheets, nearly sending it into the mud. One woman reached out quickly, pinning it with sharp efficiency. The woman laughed at her own near misstep, shaking her head, while the others teased her gently. Elizabeth smiled. It was a small, simple moment. But these were the moments that stayed with her. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth's observational nature deepened further, almost as though the castle itself encouraged it. The winter storms kept everyone indoors more often than usual. Fires crackled in every room. Shadows deepened in the corners. Conversations softened. People passed each other in narrow spaces with quiet nods and shared glances. And Elizabeth watched it all. She saw when a servant hid a cough behind her sleeve so as not to be deemed unfit for duty. She saw when a guard lingered a little longer by the door of the great hall, his fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. She noticed the moment a visiting nobleman's smile faltered ever so slightly when offered watered wine instead of ale, a tiny echo of his displeasure softened by politeness. These were small things, perhaps trivial in the grand workings of a kingdom, but they were the threads that wove together the life of the castle, and Elizabeth found herself drawn not to the dramatic events of royal life, but to these quiet truths that lived in the spaces between. Sometimes, when the castle slept, she would walk the corridors with Lady Rowan's permission, carrying a single candle for light. The stones felt colder at night. The air grew still, heavy with the breath of centuries. And in that silence, Elizabeth felt more connected to her home than ever. She imagined the lives of those who had walked these halls long before she was born. The queens, the servants, the scribes, the guards. All of them had left faint imprints in the stones. All of them had shaped this place in ways the world never recorded. Observation, she realized, was not merely a skill. It was a way of honoring the quiet history of the living. There were moments, too, when her observation revealed the subtle fragility of court life. One morning, during a small gathering in the Solar, Elizabeth watched as two noblewomen debated the weaving patterns of a newly made tapestry. Their voices were polite, but their smiles did not reach their eyes. Beneath the surface, Elizabeth sensed the faint tension of rivalry, perhaps not uncommon among the ladies of the court, who often navigated social hierarchies as carefully as knights navigated battlefield formations. But what struck Elizabeth most was the way the younger noblewoman's gaze flickered toward her hands every time she spoke, as though afraid to reveal the faint trembling that betrayed her nervousness. Elizabeth noticed. She wondered whether the woman realized how transparently her anxiety glowed, like a candle's flame on the verge of guttering. The moment passed, but Elizabeth held on to the lesson quietly tucked within it. Nobility did not shield one from vulnerability. As Elizabeth grew more attuned to the subtleties of human nature, Lady Rowan began to recognize her unusual perception. More than once, the governess caught Elizabeth observing something with quiet intensity, a gesture, an exchange between servants. "You see more than most," Lady Rowan remarked one evening as they sat near the fire. The blaze cast a warm glow across the princess's face, softening her youthful features. "Not because you seek secrets, but because you do not fear silence." Elizabeth turned her gaze toward the flames. "I like when things are still," she said softly. "Stillness makes everything clearer." Lady Rowan studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded with slow approval. "Many rulers lose that ability as they grow. Hold it as long as you can." Elizabeth did not fully understand the gravity of those words, but she felt their truth. Stillness was a form of clarity. Observation was a form of understanding. And understanding was a kind of gentle strength. The castle itself seemed to recognize her nature. It offered endless opportunities to observe. The slow drip of melting icicles after a rare thaw, the soft murmur of monks chanting morning prayers from the chapel, the rhythmic hammering from the smithy drifting up to her window in muted metallic pulses. One morning she stood by the ramparts, wrapped in a thick cloak against the cold. Fog blanketed the landscape below, hiding the distant fields and villages in a soft, colorless haze. The world felt suspended, neither fully visible nor fully concealed. A guard stood nearby, his posture relaxed despite the cold. Elizabeth watched him quietly. He, too, watched the fog, though his gaze was more cautious, shaped by training and responsibility. After a long moment, he glanced at her and bowed. "Cold morning, my lady." "Yes," she replied softly. "It makes everything look different." "Aye. Harder to see what lies ahead." Elizabeth nodded, though she sensed he had meant the words literally. For her, the fog felt like the world's whisper, urging her to look more carefully, more patiently. It reminded her that not everything revealed itself at once. Some truths emerged slowly, like the faint outline of a distant tree forming through mist. The guard returned his focus to the invisible horizon. Elizabeth continued to observe, not him, not the landscape, but the moment itself, quiet, suspended, unhurried. As winter drew toward its close, Elizabeth's world began to shift again, though gently, as seasons often do in story and memory. The snow receded from the highest points of the courtyard walls. Birds ventured cautiously into the cold sunlight. The servants moved with a little more lightness in their step. But Elizabeth's observational habits did not fade. They deepened. She noticed the first drops of melting snow sliding down the stone like tears. She saw the way the stable boy patted the horses' necks with affectionate familiarity. She noticed how the cook hummed softly during the rare moments when the kitchen quieted. Always the same tune, one Elizabeth could never identify. Sometimes she wondered if all people carried patterns within them, like the intricate knots woven into Celtic designs. Their actions repeated themselves, gently looping through their days. Some patterns were easy to see. Others revealed themselves only to those who looked long enough. Elizabeth looked. And as she did, she began to understand something profound. That even those who seemed strong or busy or confident carried quiet stories within them, stories often unnoticed, unspoken, unnamed. Her own story, too, lived almost entirely in silence. Not the silence of loneliness, the silence of careful awareness. The silence of a child who saw deeply even when she did not speak. In time, her tutors would teach her diplomacy, poetry, scripture, and the intricate dance of royal expectations. But none of those lessons would matter if she no longer understood people, their worries, their hopes, their subtle fears, their unguarded moments of tenderness. Her observations were forming a foundation inside her, one she did not yet realize she would need. But that was not for today. Today was simply another day of watching, gently, steadfastly, without judgment. A day of quiet truths. A day in which the world revealed itself, not through grand events, but through the small, steady pulse of life within stone walls. Elizabeth breathed it in, held it softly, let it settle in her heart like warm embers. And the castle breathed with her. There were mornings in Princess Elizabeth's life when the castle seemed to wake more slowly than she did, as if the ancient stones themselves required time to remember the shape of daylight. Dawn unfolded gently across the small slits of her chamber window, spreading in thin, hesitant lines that settled on the floor like pale threads. The air carried the faint scent of embers cooling in the hearth, and somewhere in the corridor, muffled by thick walls and tapestries, footsteps moved with the soft certainty of those who had performed the same duties every morning for years. These were mornings that shaped her childhood, quiet, rhythmic, almost ceremonial in their stillness. Elizabeth opened her eyes long before she was expected to rise, not out of duty, nor out of restlessness, but because she had grown accustomed to the slow movement of the day's first sounds. They were like gentle markers of time, the low whisper of wind against the stone, the distant creak of a bucket being lowered into the well, the muted flap of linen as the maids began their tasks, the faint echo of a rooster from the outer fields, softened by distance and cold. The world woke carefully, and so did she. Rising in the mornings was itself a small ritual. Elizabeth's maid, a quiet woman named Alice, entered with careful steps, bowing her head as she approached. She carried a basin of water, steam drifting in thin curls into the chilly air. Elizabeth watched the steam rise as though it were a living thing, soft, slow, ephemeral. Alice placed the basin on a wooden stand beside the window. "Good morning, my lady," she whispered, the words barely breaking the silence. Elizabeth nodded in return. She spoke little during these early hours. Words felt too loud, too heavy, too disruptive. Instead, she let the rhythm of the ritual guide her. Alice dipped a cloth into the warm water and wrung it gently before offering it to her. Elizabeth pressed the cloth to her face. Warmth spread across her chilled skin, a small comfort in a world carved from stone and winter. Dressing, too, was a quiet ceremony. Layers of linen first, then wool, then the heavier garments suited for whatever the day required. Alice's hands moved with steady precision, securing ties, smoothing fabric, adjusting hems. Elizabeth stood still, not out of formality, but because she had learned that stillness made the ritual easier and somehow more meaningful. Over time, she came to understand that these small duties were not chores. They were acts of care, performed by hands that worked tirelessly, quietly, and without applause. Alice rarely spoke unless spoken to, yet her presence had become one of the steady pillars of Elizabeth's mornings. Her hands were gentle, her movements smooth, her expression always composed. Elizabeth noticed all of it. She always had. Once dressed, Elizabeth often paused by the window to watch the courtyard below. In winter, the ground remained hard and frosted, the air tinged with the smell of earth and fire. Servants crossed the yard in predictable patterns, the stable boy leading 2 sleepy horses toward the outer gate, the cook's apprentice carrying a sack of grain with both arms, the steward directing the early tasks with brisk gestures. To Elizabeth, these small moments were a tapestry of life, a quiet world unfolding in steady motions. She did not see them as lesser routines, nor as the background hum of royal living. Instead, she saw them as the gentle structure of each day, the foundation upon which her father's kingdom rested. Royalty might have ruled the land, but it was the humblest hands that kept it living. Her duties, too, were beginning to form their own patterns. Though she was still a child, the court expected her to learn certain rhythms: how to stand, how to sit, how to walk with measured grace, how to address nobles with respect, how to fold her hands during prayer, how to observe without interrupting, how to remain composed even when her heart raced. These lessons were not taught through stern instruction. They were absorbed slowly, through presence, imitation, and the unspoken expectations woven into the fabric of royal life. Elizabeth accepted them without complaint. She did not yet know how heavy such expectations could grow, but she sensed that even the lightest rituals carried purpose. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The royal family ate together only on certain days. On most mornings, Elizabeth dined with Lady Rowan in a small chamber off the great hall. The fire crackled softly. The table held simple fare: bread, soft cheese, warmed ale diluted with water. Lady Rowan always folded her hands before eating, bowing her head in a stillness that Elizabeth mirrored. Their mornings were filled not with commands or expectations, but with gentle conversation. Lady Rowan spoke softly, her voice like a thread stitching the silence into something warm. She asked Elizabeth about her dreams, about the details she had noticed the day before, about the small impressions that lingered in her mind. It was during these meals that Elizabeth first understood that reflection was its own ritual, that looking inward was as important as observing outward. Lady Rowan taught her that a princess must learn not only what happens around her, but what happens within her. "Your thoughts," the governess said one morning, "are like seeds. If you tend them carefully, they will grow into the roots of your character." Elizabeth considered this in silence. She did not speak right away. Instead, she listened to the fire, the faint creak of the wooden shutters in the wind, the soft clatter of a spoon against a bowl. She felt the words settle inside her like warm coals. After breakfast, Elizabeth's duties began. They were not grand tasks, no diplomatic meetings, no estate management, no decisions that shaped the realm. Her duties were small, soft, foundational, the kind that taught her how to move through the world with steadiness. Some mornings she spent in the chapel, reciting prayers under the watchful guidance of Father Aldrich. The priest's voice was deep and sonorous, echoing gently against the stone arches. Elizabeth loved the chapel's stillness, the way sound softened as it lifted toward the vaulted ceiling, the way candlelight rippled across worn sculptures and faded frescoes. She loved the quiet, the certainty, the way the words of ancient prayers seemed to hum through the stones themselves. But more than anything, she loved the way people changed in the chapel. Their postures softened, their voices lowered, their faces relaxed, shedding the small masks worn throughout the day. Even Father Aldrich, stern as he was, held a gentleness beneath his rigidity, something Elizabeth glimpsed only when he extinguished the last candle at night, his movements lingering, almost reverent.
Other mornings brought lessons in etiquette, how to curtsy with graceful precision, how to greet nobles of varying rank, how to stand without fidgeting, even when silence stretched long. These lessons took place in a small practice solar, where Lady Rowan guided her gently, correcting her posture with the lightest touch. Elizabeth did not mind these lessons. They were slow, quiet, measured. Each movement felt like part of a soft, ancient dance. She found comfort in the rhythm of it. Step, turn, bow, rise. Nothing hurried, nothing loud. Her least favorite lessons, though she never said so aloud, were those that required her to sit perfectly still for long periods while Lady Rowan instructed her on the intricate histories of noble families. These genealogies stretched back generations, weaving through alliances and betrayals, marriages and wars. Elizabeth listened carefully, trying to hold each name in her mind like a bead on a string. But it was difficult. Faces and stories blurred together. The hall grew warm. The candlelight flickered softly, and Elizabeth's gaze drifted, sometimes to the window, sometimes to the fire, sometimes to the shadows on the floor. Always quietly, never out of disrespect, simply because her heart belonged not to lists of names, but to the living world around her. And Lady Rowan knew this. She never scolded her for drifting. She simply paused, waited, and continued. But among all these gentle duties, the afternoons held Elizabeth's favorite ritual, visiting the castle's inner courtyard garden. Even in winter, when most flowers lay dormant beneath the soil, the garden offered her a small sanctuary. Evergreen shrubs held their color. Frost sparkled across dormant flower beds like thousands of tiny mirrors. The fountain, stilled by cold, formed delicate icicles along its basin. Elizabeth walked the garden paths slowly, her breath drifting in pale clouds. The air smelled of earth and stone and cold water. Monks from the nearby cloister tended to the herbs that survived winter, their robes rustling softly as they moved through the beds. One monk, Brother Anselm, always greeted Elizabeth with a gentle smile. He had a quiet manner that resonated with her, a man who spoke little, listened much, and moved with an ease that made the garden feel even more peaceful. Sometimes he offered her small tasks, watering winter herbs indoors, trimming dead branches, gathering dried lavender for the chapel. Elizabeth performed each task with careful hands, grateful for the stillness they provided. In the garden, she felt most herself, not because she was free from duty,
but because the duties here were soft, natural, grounding. As the day wore on, Elizabeth attended whatever duties remained, sometimes visiting her father briefly, sometimes observing the steward at work, sometimes sitting with her embroidery frame, threading soft colors through coarse fabric. Embroidery was another ritual, slow, rhythmic, almost meditative. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, though she often had to pause to untangle stubborn threads. Lady Rowan praised her patience, though Elizabeth did not think of it as patience. To her, embroidery mirrored the quiet lessons of the world, small movements building slowly into something meaningful. While she stitched, she listened to the distant clatter of the hall, to the muffled laughter of servants, to the footsteps passing beyond the solar door. Each sound was part of the castle's heartbeat, and she learned to hear it. Late afternoons brought a different kind of quiet, one softened by the sinking sun, when the castle seemed to exhale after a long day. Servants' voices dropped. Fires were stoked for evening warmth. The corridors filled with the muted warmth of torches being lit one by one. Elizabeth often wandered with Lady Rowan during these hours. They walked the upper corridors, looking down into the courtyard as torches flickered below. The world seemed to shift from stone-cold gray to fire-lit gold. These walks were not lessons, and yet they taught her more than she realized. Lady Rowan pointed out details Elizabeth had not yet noticed, the way a tapestry depicted a battle from long ago, the subtle shift in architecture between one wing of the castle and another, the worn edges of stairs that revealed centuries of footsteps. "These stones, remember?" Rowan would say softly, and Elizabeth believed her. Evenings were a quiet close to the ritual of her day. Sometimes he joined larger meals in the great hall, though these occasions overwhelmed her senses, the noise, the movement, the sheer number of eyes. She sat with poise, listened more than she spoke, and retreated early when permitted. Most evenings, though, she dined in the smaller chamber again. Afterward, Alice prepared her for bed just as gently as she had prepared her for the day. Elizabeth's favorite moment came when the candle was lit beside her bed and all other lights were dimmed. The room, held in the soft glow of a single flame, felt sheltered from the world. The quiet was heavy but soothing, like a blanket. Alice brushed out her hair slowly, each stroke smooth, steady, comforting. The fire crackled faintly behind them. When Alice finished, she bowed her head and withdrew. Elizabeth crawled beneath the blankets. She listened to the castle settling, its sighs deep and ancient. Her final ritual was simple. She whispered a small prayer not for herself, but for the people she had watched throughout the day. The maids, the servants, the monks, the guards. A quiet blessing for those who made her world steady. And only then did she allow sleep to come. There were rooms in the castle that Elizabeth had not noticed until she began her 7th year of life. Rooms tucked away between stairwells, behind carved doors, at the ends of quiet corridors where only the softest footsteps ventured. These were not the grand halls of feasts or ceremonies, nor the cold chambers reserved for the guards. These were the hidden places where work happened, steady and uncelebrated, shaping the castle's heartbeat day after day. One of these rooms soon became central to her days, the weaving chamber. It sat near the southern wall of the keep, where the stones stayed warmer through winter, and the small windows allowed just enough pale light to reach the looms. Elizabeth had passed the room countless times without realizing what lived behind the heavy oak door. The low murmur of women's voices, the soft clack of wooden frames, the whisper of threads moving through practiced hands. But one morning, Lady Rowan took her there as part of her growing lessons in the gentle duties of a princess. "You must learn where the strength of a household lies," Rowan said softly as they walked through the corridor. "Not always in swords, not always in coin. Sometimes it lies in quiet hands, weaving the fabric that keeps the cold out and the people warm." Elizabeth remained silent, absorbing the weight of those words. She already sensed their truth.
When they entered the chamber, the air felt different from every other part of the castle. Warmer, softer, filled with the faint scent of wool and flax. The warmth came not from fires, but from the constant motion of bodies, the steady rhythm of hands that rarely paused. Lanterns hung from iron hooks along the wall, casting dim pools of light over the looms. The women looked up when Elizabeth stepped inside, not startled, not nervous, just calmly aware. These were women who held themselves with quiet dignity, sleeves rolled, hair bound, fingers calloused by craft. They nodded respectfully to Lady Rowan, then offered Elizabeth small, kind smiles. Their presence reminded Elizabeth of the servants who tended her chamber fires and washed her linens, people who lived inside the castle but remained just outside the boundaries of her daily world. "Good morning, my lady," murmured a woman with silvery hair pulled into a braid. Her voice was soft, steady like a loom's thrum. Elizabeth bowed her head slightly, imitating Lady Rowan. The governess led her deeper into the room, past baskets of carded wool, skeins of dyed thread, and the quiet ghost of dust drifting through the shafts of pale light. "This is Mistress Hesper," Rowan said, stopping beside an older woman seated at a large loom. "She oversees all cloth made for the household." Hesper studied Elizabeth with gentle, thoughtful eyes that had seen decades of thread pass beneath her fingers. "A princess must know many things," the woman said in a calm, resonant voice. "And one of them is how cloth becomes cloth." Elizabeth nodded. She did not fully understand the depth of that statement, but she felt it was important. Hesper invited her to sit beside her. The stool was small, carved smooth by years of use. Elizabeth climbed onto it, tucking her hands into her lap. She felt the warmth radiating from the older woman's steady movements, the soft vibration of the loom's wooden frame. "Watch first," Hesper murmured. Elizabeth leaned forward. The weaver's hands were gentle and deliberate. She lifted threads one by one, guiding the shuttle through the narrow gap with a soft glide. Then she pressed the frame down, tightening the weave. The sound was rhythmic, wooden, warm, predictable. Elizabeth found herself falling into the cadence of it, like the soft beating of a slow, steady heart. Hesper did not explain immediately. She did not teach with words. Instead, she allowed the movements to speak, as if the loom itself carried a language older than speech. Eventually, she said quietly, "Every thread matters. A single flaw can unravel the whole." Elizabeth nodded again. She understood that, more deeply than she expected. Lady Rowan watched from nearby, her arms folded gently as though guarding the moment. After some time, Hesper handed Elizabeth a small shuttle, lightweight, smooth, sized for a child's hands. "Try," she said simply. Elizabeth hesitated, feeling the unfamiliar weight. But Hesper placed her hands over the girl's, guiding her slowly. Together they moved the shuttle through the threads. Elizabeth felt each fiber brush against the wood, felt the resistance and the softness. Her breath slowed, her shoulders relaxed.
The loom seemed to answer each movement with its soft clack. Elizabeth found the rhythm. Not perfect, not without stuttering motions, but real. When she completed her first row, she looked up shyly. Hesper smiled, a small, approving curve of the lips. "Well done, my lady," she said. Elizabeth felt warmth spread across her chest. The lessons continued through winter. Not daily, but often enough that Elizabeth began to look forward to them. Lady Rowan allowed her to spend one morning each week in the weaving chamber. At first, Elizabeth feared the work would be difficult, or that the women would watch her with tense curiosity, unsure how to act around a child of noble blood. But none of that happened. The chamber held no judgment, only quiet industry. The women did not treat her like royalty. They treated her like a learner. This comforted her more than she expected. Sometimes she worked beside Hesper. Other days she sat near the younger weavers, who spoke softly about their own families, their hopes for spring, the small details of life that rarely reached the upper chambers of the keep. Elizabeth listened to everything. She found their voices soothing, and slowly she began to understand something new. The women spoke differently depending on the rhythm of the loom. When the work was fast and precise, they fell silent. But when motions grew slower, when threads needed gentle teasing or knots required untangling, the women's voices softened into quiet conversation. Elizabeth learned to recognize these two kinds of silence, the working silence and the resting silence where words lived. One particular morning, Elizabeth arrived early. Alice had woken her before the servants' bells, and the castle still hovered in a half-sleeping hush. The weaving chamber was empty except for Hesper, who sat alone before her loom. The single lantern cast a circle of light on the stone floor, and the old woman hummed softly, a tune without words, slow and steady. Elizabeth hesitated at the doorway. "You may come in, child," Hesper said gently without turning. "The morning welcomes quiet visitors." Elizabeth stepped inside, drawn by the warmth of the small lantern flame and the hum of the loom. She sat in her usual place. "Why do you hum?" she asked softly. Hesper smiled at her loom. "Because each cloth has a rhythm, a pulse. The hum keeps my hands moving in time with it." Elizabeth considered this with all the seriousness a young mind could hold. "Does everything have a rhythm?" "Most things worth tending do," Hesper replied. "The land, the seasons, the fire, the heart." Elizabeth looked down at her hands, imagining the rhythm in them, the quiet beat beneath her skin. "Even princesses?" she whispered. "Especially princesses." Elizabeth felt her chest warm again. The hum of the loom deepened. She found herself breathing with it. As weeks passed, Elizabeth's weaving improved. She learned to wind thread neatly, to separate fibers gently, to guide the shuttle in smooth arcs. Her hands grew steadier, her posture more aligned, her mind quieter. She discovered a comfort she had not known before, a comfort rooted in repetition, in small achievements, in the subtle satisfaction of watching something grow beneath her fingers. Lady Rowan observed her progress with careful eyes. One afternoon, as Elizabeth worked beside Hesper, Rowan approached the loom and examined the newest section of cloth. "It is good work," she said softly. Simple words, but they settled deeply. Elizabeth looked up, surprised. "Truly?" "Truly," Rowan answered. Hesper gave a small nod of agreement. "She has a patient heart." Elizabeth felt a glow of pride, soft and warm like a small ember. But Rowan added gently, "Remember, my dear, lessons of the loom are not simply lessons in craft." Elizabeth tilted her head. "What else are they?" Rowan rested a hand lightly on the loom's frame. "They teach you to build slowly, to mend quietly, to see how small things become strong when woven together." Hesper nodded. "A kingdom is no different." Elizabeth breathed in the weight of those words. Threads, kingdoms, people, all woven, all connected.
In time, Elizabeth came to recognize more than just rhythm. She noticed the subtler things, the texture differences between wool and flax, the faint scent left by certain natural dyes, the way winter light changed the color of cloth. One afternoon, the youngest weaver, Marian, a girl of perhaps 17, showed her how to dye thread with crushed berries. They worked over a steaming pot, the air filled with a tart, reddish scent. Elizabeth dipped the thread carefully, watching it darken, absorbing the color slowly, like a living thing. Marian smiled shyly. "My mother taught me this." Elizabeth held the thread up to the light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Marian said softly, "but fragile until it dries." Elizabeth understood. Some things required patience before they revealed their true strength. She carried that thought with her for days. One of the most memorable days came during late winter, when the castle grew especially cold and wind scraped against the shutters with sharp insistence. The weaving room was warmer than usual. Several extra braziers had been brought in to protect the threads. The women worked in silence, broken only by occasional murmurs. Elizabeth was practicing on her smaller loom when one of the threads snapped. She froze. The broken thread hung limp and useless, a tiny flaw that disrupted the entire row. Her breath quickened, her fingers trembled. She feared she had ruined the work, that she would disappoint Hesper, Rowan, the women who had been so patient. Hesper approached before panic could settle fully. "It is all right," she said calmly. "Threads break. That is their nature." Elizabeth looked up with wide, worried eyes. "But what do I do?" "Fix it." "How?" Hesper knelt beside her. Her movements were slow and deliberate. "Watch." She took the two ends of the broken thread, teased them gently, and twisted them together carefully. Her fingers moved as though coaxing life back into the fibers. Then she tied a tiny knot, so small Elizabeth could barely see it, and smoothed it into place. "The cloth will remember the break," Hesper said quietly, "but it will grow strong around it." Elizabeth touched the repaired thread gently. It felt whole again. "Does everything mend like this?" she asked. Hesper's eyes softened. "Not everything, but most things if you tend them with care." Elizabeth carried that lesson deep within her heart. By spring's early stirrings, Elizabeth had begun weaving a small cloth of her own, a simple square made of soft, undyed wool. The women had cleared a small section of a loom for her, letting her return to it each week. It was not perfect. It held small lumps, uneven lines, knots where mistakes had happened. But it was hers. She worked slowly, savoring every moment. The cloth grew inch by inch, almost shyly, as though revealing itself only when she was ready. One morning, as she completed the final row, the women all paused their work. Not dramatically, just long enough to acknowledge the quiet accomplishment. Hesper cut the cloth free from the frame and placed it gently in Elizabeth's hands. "You have made something," she said. Elizabeth stared at it. The weight, the softness, the warmth held between her palms. For a moment she did not speak. She felt something inside her settle like snow drifting to earth. "What should I do with it?" she asked. "Keep it," Hesper replied. "Let it remind you that small things, done with patience, shape the world." Elizabeth folded the cloth carefully, pressing it against her chest. A treasure. Not because it was beautiful, though it was in its own humble way, but because it held her time, her effort, her quiet growth. It felt like a piece of her. That evening, Elizabeth placed the cloth in a small wooden box beside her bed. Alice noticed, but said nothing, simply smiling to herself, understanding in a way that required no words. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the cloth one last time before sleep, feeling the ridges, the softness, the tiny imperfections that made it perfectly hers. The castle exhaled in the quiet hours of night. Torches burned low. Wind brushed faintly against the shutters. Elizabeth lay beneath her blankets, the woven cloth beside her heart. She felt more connected to the world than she had before, to the women who worked quietly, to the threads that held warmth through winter, to the notion that strength grew slowly, gently, with steady hands. In the stillness of the dark, she whispered a small prayer, not of royalty, but of gratitude for quiet lessons and the humble craft that had become part of her childhood. And as sleep drifted over her, she imagined the loom's steady heartbeat, weaving through her dreams. Night did not simply fall upon the castle. It seeped into it, softly, gradually, like ink spreading across parchment. The transformation was subtle, and Elizabeth began to notice it only as she grew older and became more attuned to the quiet rhythms that lived beneath the surface of each day. There was a moment, just after sunset, when the castle seemed to hold its breath. The last streaks of daylight lingered on the horizon, washed in muted lavender and pale rose. Torches were lit one by one along the corridors, their flames fluttering with a cautious grace. The great hall dimmed, the courtyard shadows deepened, and the sounds of daytime, footsteps, conversations, clattering tools, faded into a silence that felt as though it had been waiting all along. Elizabeth loved this moment most. It was neither day nor night, but something between, a fragile pause in which the world seemed to soften. She often found herself standing at the narrow window of her chamber, watching the sky shift toward darkness. The winter air turned sharp and crystalline, carrying the distant bark of a dog or the muted clunk of a stable door being shut. Frost crept along the edges of the stone, shimmering in torchlight like thin threads of silver. The castle became a world of whispers. But as night deepened, Elizabeth learned that the castle did not sleep. Not truly. Not all at once. Its life simply changed its shape. Servants moved quietly through the halls, carrying embers to distant hearths, checking shutters for drafts, ensuring that the winter cold did not creep too deeply into the chambers. Guards walked their routes with slow, steady steps, spears tapping faintly on stone. Their lanterns swayed, casting arcs of gold that danced against the walls. From her window, Elizabeth watched their paths, predictable, rhythmic, comforting. She felt safe knowing the same men made those rounds each night, their silhouettes steady against firelit stone. But the castle's nighttime life was not only the domain of servants and soldiers. Old sounds emerged when the day grew quiet enough. The groan of settling beams,
the soft scurry of mice in the granaries, the muffled coo of doves roosting in the upper towers. The stones themselves seemed to sigh with the weight of centuries. Elizabeth found these sounds soothing, not frightening. They were the castle's dreams.
Lady Rowan, ever attentive to Elizabeth's quiet nature, began incorporating nighttime lessons into her education. These were not formal lessons. They were not written in any ledger nor tied to etiquette manuals. They were simply gentle walks through the calmer halls of the castle as evening transitioned into full darkness. On such nights, Elizabeth walked beside Rowan with a heavy cloak wrapped around her shoulders, the wool brushing softly against her wrists. The torches flickered as they passed, and Rowan's own lantern cast a warm halo of light that seemed to follow them like a loyal companion. "Night reveals what day hides," Rowan would say quietly. "A castle breathes differently when the world sleeps." Elizabeth understood. She felt it with each step. These evening walks taught her things she would not have learned in daylight. How the air changed near certain corridors, which tapestries fluttered slightly when winter winds pressed against hidden cracks, where the stone floors warmed from the kitchens below, which doors creaked softly from age, and which stayed silent from careful repair. She learned the castle not as a structure, but as a living being. One night, Rowan brought her to the upper ramparts. The air was cold enough to sting, and Elizabeth wrapped her cloak tighter. As they stepped onto the battlement walkway, the sky opened before them, vast, dark, infinite. Stars shone with icy clarity, scattered like shards of broken silver. The moon hung low, partially hidden by thin clouds. Elizabeth had rarely been outside after dusk. The world felt different, larger, quieter, almost sacred. The wind brushed strands of her hair across her cheeks. She breathed deeply, inhaling air that tasted of snow and stone. Below, the courtyard lay in near darkness, lit only by a few lanterns near the gate. She could see the shapes of horses shifting in the stables, their breaths rising like pale smoke. A few guards walked the perimeter, their armor glinting faintly. "It feels," Elizabeth whispered, searching for the word, "older at night." Rowan nodded. Night strips away distraction. All that remains is what is true. Elizabeth's gaze lingered on the distant fields where winter still held the land in its grip. She imagined the farmers sleeping in their cottages, the sheep huddled in barns, the forests standing silent and patient. The world felt vast but gentle, quiet but alive, and Elizabeth felt small in a way that comforted her. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth began noticing patterns in the nighttime castle that others overlooked. She learned the sound of each guard's footsteps, some heavier, some softer, some with a slight drag from an old injury. She learned the slow rhythm of the kitchen hearth being banked for the night. She learned the hour by the way the shadows shifted in her chamber. And she learned that not everything was silent. Sometimes, soft voices drifted from the chapel where the monks kept their hours of prayer. The low chanting seemed to echo through the stone, as though the walls themselves whispered the ancient words. The first time Elizabeth heard the midnight chorus, she sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound was solemn and calm, deep voices carrying in gentle waves through the cold air. Alice, who slept lightly in the adjoining room, entered to check on her. "It is only the brothers' night prayers, my lady," she whispered. "They sing to keep the darkness company." Elizabeth nodded, lying back down, but she continued listening until the last note faded. After that night, she waited for the chance whenever she found herself awake. Their sound comforted her, like a soft hand resting over her heart. One evening, Rowan guided her somewhere she had never been after dark. The Great Hall. During the day, the hall was loud, echoing with movement, bustling with servants, ringing with the clang of metal plates. But at night, it transformed completely. Only a few torches burned near the entrance. The long tables stood empty, benches pushed in neatly. The hearth at the far end glowed with a faint bed of coals. Shadows clung to the high stone walls, flickering gently with each shift of the flames. Elizabeth stepped onto the cold floor, the quiet stretching around her like a deep pool. The emptiness of the hall made her voice feel too loud to use, so she remained silent. Rowan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "This is where daylight hides," the governess murmured. "Noise, people, obligations, all of it sleeps now. A hall at night remembers what it once was." Elizabeth looked up at the banners hanging from the rafters, dim shapes swaying slightly. She imagined generations of people passing through this room, hundreds of footsteps, countless meals, celebrations, griefs, decisions that shaped the world outside the castle walls. She thought of how many nights had looked like this, how many years, how many winters. The quiet pressed gently into her chest. Sometimes Elizabeth's nighttime observations were simple. A servant extinguishing torches with a long iron snuffer. A cat slipping across the corridor with silent paws. The faint drip of melting frost falling from the roof tiles. A tapestry swaying from a hidden draft. Other times, she sensed things more difficult to name. A softness in the air just before snow began. A heaviness in the hall after a long day of heated discussion. A quiet warmth in the kitchen even after the fires died. She felt these changes instinctively, as though her heart had attuned itself to the castle's own pulse. Lady Rowan noticed her awareness, but never praised it openly. Instead, she continued guiding Elizabeth through these silent lessons, allowing her to form her own understanding. "Listen," Rowan would whisper sometimes, and Elizabeth did. With her ears, her eyes, her breath, her presence. Night taught her what daytime overlooked. On especially cold nights, when wind howled like a distant creature across the towers, the castle felt smaller, not darker, merely more enclosed, as though drawing its people closer to its heart. Elizabeth often sat by her chamber hearth during such nights, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks upward like tiny spirits. Alice sat nearby, mending clothes or tending to small tasks. The young maid worked quietly, her presence calm and grounding. Sometimes Elizabeth asked her to speak about her childhood or her parents, and Alice obliged in soft murmurs. Stories of village life, small joys, hardships softened by time. Elizabeth cherished these quiet conversations. They felt like whispered threads connecting her to a world beyond stone walls. After Alice finished her tasks and slipped away to sleep, Elizabeth would lie awake a little longer, listening to the castle breathe. Warm creaks from the settling beams, faint whistles where wind slipped through tiny gaps, the comforting hiss of logs shifting in the hearth. Night was never silent. It was simply softer, and Elizabeth began to love it. The most profound lessons came from Rowan one night in late winter, when a thin veil of snow drifted across the courtyard, and the air smelled of cold stone and extinguished torches. Instead of leading Elizabeth along their usual route, Rowan guided her to a forgotten corner of the castle,
where an old, unused stairway wound upward into shadow. The torch in Rowan's hand cast eerie, elongated shapes across the narrow walls. Elizabeth did not fear. Night had become too familiar. At the top of the stairs, Rowan opened a narrow door into a small chamber overlooking the east. Only a single, shutterless window allowed moonlight to spill onto the floor. "This," Rowan said softly, "is where I came when I was your age." Elizabeth stepped inside, feeling the quiet like a blanket around her. The room smelled faintly of dust and cold night air. Rowan knelt so she was at Elizabeth's height. "I brought you here because you are beginning to hear the castle," she said. "Not simply its noises, but its life, its history, its moods." Elizabeth swallowed. I feel it." "You do," Rowan whispered. "The night has taught you to listen, and that is a gift rarer than any jewel a princess may wear." Elizabeth felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the cold air. Rowan placed the torch in a sconce and stood beside the window. She gestured for Elizabeth to join her. "Look," she said. Elizabeth gazed over the moonlit landscape, the sleeping courtyard, the quiet village beyond the outer walls, the wide fields washed in silver. The world felt vast and small all at once. "A princess must see her world in daylight," Rowan murmured. "But she must understand it in darkness." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I think," she whispered, "I understand a little now." Rowan smiled with softness reserved only for her. "You will understand more with time."
They remained there for a long time, wrapped in silence, not an empty silence, but one filled with meaning. When they finally returned to Elizabeth's chamber, the torches in the halls had burned low, and the castle seemed to hum softly beneath their feet. Elizabeth climbed into bed, exhausted not by movement, but by the depth of the night. Alice pulled the blankets to her chin, whispered a gentle good night. Elizabeth stared at the ceiling through half-lidded eyes, listening once more to the faint rise and fall of the castle's breath. She thought of the guards on their rounds, the monks in prayer, the servants banking the last fires, the wind against the towers, the stones settling into ancient rest. All of them part of the same quiet world, and she felt safe, held, home. As sleep drifted toward her like a slow tide, she whispered one final thought. "Night shows the truth." Then the castle wrapped her in its steady warmth, and she slipped into dreams threaded with moonlight and quiet halls.
And now, as the final candle burns low and the last echoes of the castle fade into quiet, how a long journey with Princess Elizabeth gently comes to an end. We have walked through stone corridors, lingered beside hearth fires, stood beneath winter skies, and watched the world through the soft, thoughtful eyes of a young medieval princess. Her days, though distant in time, remind us that history is often built from quiet moments, the kind we rarely hear about, yet the kind that shape a life. If your thoughts feel heavier now, like snow settling on a silent courtyard, that is perfectly all right. Let them fall where they may. The night is deep, and the world outside this story can wait until morning. For now, you have wandered through centuries, and your mind deserves its rest. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the faint glow of a single lantern guiding you down a peaceful corridor, the gentle rustle of tapestries, the soft hush of winter wind against old stone walls. Let the warmth of this quiet medieval world stay with you a little longer. Breathe slowly, rest deeply, and when you wake, may you carry a small piece of this calm with you into the day ahead. Good night, and may your dreams be soft, steady, and peaceful.